And about that time, my gunner called me and told me we're being attacked by Japanese fighters. And I looked again, and all of a sudden, that was the Jap fleet. I could see the carriers there.
Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them. Volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, they that had fought so well came through the jaws of death back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them. The Imperial Navy was poised to eliminate an American presence in the Pacific.
That the Japanese at that time had taken the Philippines, taken Singapore, and they had done things people thought was impossible.
In their path was an insignificant coral outcropping just east of the international date line. Midway. This is the story of the sailors, marines, and airmen who defiantly stood in the path of the Japanese naval armada, of an admiral who sent his forces into harm's way. This is Destination Point Luck. Voices from Midway. Today, oxidized iron coats a 3-inch naval gun that still stands sentry on Midway's eastern island. Old runways that serviced Brewster Buffaloes, B-17s, and TBF Avengers now lie cracked and overgrown, and everywhere there are goonie birds. In the fall of 1940, this island and the ships of the Pacific Fleet teemed with young men ready to do battle. Who were these Americans, and what forged their will?
There was no question that we were heading for war. But at that point in time, just verbal accusations traded back and forth.
In 1939, Hitler had invaded the Low Countries in Poland, and the news was very frightening. And I thought about that, and I said, well, if I go aboard a ship, I'll have something to eat, clean clothes, and nothing will happen to it. They won't sink it.
I think that that generation was unusual. Most of us came from poor families.
I think one point that has to be mentioned is the country was emerging from a depression. It was very, very difficult to go to school or find work. So the Navy found itself in a rather comfortable position, and they took advantage of it.
November 26, 1941, the Kido Butai, the Japanese Mobile Force, leaves Hitukapu Bay and steams at a steady 24 knots for a point 230 miles south of Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands. At 6 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched their first wave of fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes for the attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. America is at war and on the defensive.
Pearl Harbor was awesome. You could still smell death in the air, the smoke, the ships upside down.
A population hardened by a decade of depression and hardship rushes to serve. On April 18, 1942, 16 American twin-engine bombers appeared over the Japanese mainland. Launched from the carrier Hornet, the bombs dropped by the planes did little physical damage to the Japanese cities, but the psychological damage was great. Admiral Yamamoto had been pressing for a plan for the capture of both Midway and the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese Army had resisted the plan for operations in the Central Pacific before the homeland was bombed. After the raid, Yamamoto's Operation MI was fully supported.
That was a real brave thing that those pilots did. That bombing really generated Admiral Yamamoto to see that they better go to Midway and defeat us at Midway now.
When would the Kido Butai strike next? What was the Japanese Army and Navy planning?
Commander Rochefort was a real authority on the Japanese language. He had spent 3 years in Japan as a language student, under total immersion studying Japanese language, culture.
Commander Rochefort was not alone in Japan. In the 1930s, 36 officers had gone through language and culture studies in Japan. Also studying there was Commander Layton, who was to become Chief of Intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet from 1940 on.
Layton knew Yamamoto personally. When they were in Japan, Layton was a bachelor, unmarried. Rochefort was married and had his family with him, but Layton went with the unmarried group, and among other things, he used to play poker with Admiral Yamamoto. He wasn't an admiral then, he was a captain. But Layton had had exposure and personal acquaintance with Yamamoto, and he did have a feeling for how the Japanese thought. Rochefort would develop hunches about things he was seeing in communications intercept, which were kind of remote and things you couldn't put your finger on. And he anticipated the Midway attack beginning about sometime in April 1942, because he began to see a pattern developing even before the Battle of the Coral Sea.
Combat intelligence from both Australian coast watchers and our own radio intercept units gave us advance notice of Japanese plans for an attack upon Port Moresby. The result was the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first battle in naval history where the opposing forces' ships were never in direct combat, but all action was between carrier-launched planes.
Just before they located our task force, 17 and 11, and we sank the Shoho, which was a light carrier, and damaged the Zukaku and the Shokaku, which caused them not to be able to, one of them not to be able to land their aircraft. So effectively it put that aircraft carrier out of business.
As far as the battle, never been in anything like that. It's just absolutely unbelievable what that guy up there is trying to kill me. And the other thing is, when they had dive bombers, that dive bomber was after me, nobody else. My general quarters was on the flight deck. But the twists and turns, and I gotta say a good word for Captain Buckmaster. He saved that ship, conning it away from torpedoes and bombs.
But anyway, we had a lot of close misses on the starboard side. But Captain Buckmaster would see the dive bombers coming down and give hard to port or hard to starboard, whichever. But we did take some real structural damage from near misses. The concussion and the shrapnel from the bombs caused us severe damage. But the one bomb that hit the deck went down to the 4th level and killed the repair party.
At the Battle of Coral Sea, the Yorktown suffered damage. The Japanese were convinced the Yorktown was finished. The Japanese lost a light carrier, and the fleet carrier Shokaku had serious bomb damage, and the fleet carrier Zuikaku's air group was badly depleted. When Admiral Nimitz took over from Admiral Kimmel, he retained the staff.
When Nimitz took over, he told Layton, he says, I want you to tell me what Admiral Yamamoto was thinking and planning, and most importantly, I want you to tell me today what he's going to do tomorrow. Japanese communications were being transmitted by Morse code in digits, in numbers. The digits of the JN25 code were 5 digits, 5-digit code groups. By the time of the Battle of Midway, we had recovered probably 40% of those code groups. And the result of that was we were able to read enough of the message texts to make intelligent sense out of what the message was about. We knew from the follow-up translations after the Pearl Harbor attack that Pearl Harbor was AH. And we also had had references to AF and an AK. We discovered that AK, I think it was AK, was French frigate Shoals. That's where the submarines met. And we knew that Hawaii was AH. There was also one reference in some of that traffic to AF, which we kind of deduced was Midway.
Analysts at Pearl Harbor and in Washington were aware that the Japanese were planning a major operation. The analysts in Washington were convinced that it would be an attack against Hawaii or possibly the west coast of the United States, not a small atoll like Midway.
And they were focused on that so intently that they rejected the idea that it was Midway. All of our circumstantial evidence showed it to be Midway. And we told Admiral Nimitz that.
About 10 days prior to the battle, when Admiral Nimitz was preparing to send his inferior forces out against the Japanese fleet, Admiral King sent a communication to Sink Pack and said, "I cannot permit you to risk your limited forces against this large fleet unless you know for certain what the target is."
Commander Holmes was standing by my desk talking to me when Commander Rochefort approached him and said, "Jasper, we've got to do something to prove to the world that AF is Midway."
Jasper Holmes had been an engineering professor at the University of Hawaii and had worked on studies on how to provision Midway Island and knew that fresh water had to be produced by evaporators. He proposed Pearl Harbor contact Midway Island via the underwater phone cable that still connected both islands. He reasoned that if we ordered the commander to broadcast a radio message in the clear that his freshwater system had a problem, and that if we could intercept a follow-up Japanese message, we could prove AF was Midway.
The next day, they reported to Tokyo that the commanding officer of the Naval Air Station at AF had reported to his headquarters in Hawaii that he had a water casualty and had a limited supply of fresh water. Well, that cinched it. That cinched that AF was Midway.
On our way back from the Battle of Coral Sea, we stopped in an island called Tonga Taboo, and we got some food aboard the ship, and we refueled.
Well, we felt very good about it coming out like we did. They have two carriers out now. We have been damaged, but not beyond repair. And we lost only 56 men in that battle.
The refrigeration system had been blown out. All our perishables had been used up. We had nothing fresh vegetable, no fresh meat.
We had been hit in the Coral Sea pretty badly, wiped out the marine compartment completely, our living quarters.
On 27 May, on 0600 hours, 4 carriers of Kido Butai, Akagi, Hiryu, Soryu, and Kaga, followed light cruiser Nagara out of the fleet anchorage in Hiroshima Bay. Destination, Midway.
When we come back to Pearl, Admiral Nimitz immediately came aboard because he knew we'd received a bomb hit. And in the discussions, Captain Buckmaster asked the Admiral for a 6-month overhaul. Now, I have to say this, we had missed overhauls for a couple of years, for at least a couple of years, due to other things that had happened. We were overdue for an overhaul.
The shipyard workers and our own engineering estimated 3 months to make the Yorktown seaworthy. One, it was worn out. We'd been at sea at 101 days. And number two, the crew were just tired.
The word between Admiral Fletcher and Nimitz was we needed at least 3 weeks to prepare that ship to go back to Midway. Nimitz said, "You have no more than 3 days."
The number one man said it, and that's it. And so we went into dry dock and immediately, and I'll have to say a good word for the yard force at Pearl. These guys came aboard with their welders and whatever they had. They had no blueprints. The command to them was, walk through the ship. Whatever's broke, fix it. And that's exactly what they did. And in 72 hours, we went out. Now, mainly, they fixed the hole on the flight decks, so we'd have flight operations. They replaced watertight doors that had been shattered, anything of that nature. But when we left Pearl, we left with 3 boilers still not operating. And it's tough to fight a battle, and that's what cost us at Midway.
Yamamoto expected the American carriers and battleships to sortie from Pearl Harbor after Japanese landings on Attu and Midway. A Japanese northern and southern submarine cordon was to be established to detect the American ships. A large Japanese Kawanishi seaplane was to provide an aerial patrol from French frigate shoals, where it was to be refueled by a Japanese fleet submarine.
I'll admit it was a surprise to me when I later found out that the Japanese had tried to come in there and found that there were 2 U.S. ships ahead. I think that Leighton was probably sensitive enough to the Japanese use of French frigate shoals that he may well have encouraged the Pac Fleet staff to get a couple ships up there just as a precaution.
On 30 May 1942, Yorktown left the yard and headed back to sea, patched but not completely repaired. Under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, Yorktown and her escorts formed Task Force 17. The day before, Task Force 16 had sortied, comprised of carriers, Hornet and Enterprise, and additional escort vessels. Both task forces left Pearl before the Japanese submarine pickets were in place.
And I stood on deck and watched the Hornet go out and the Enterprise follow her, and the cruisers and destroyers that were our escort ships and so on. And I was aware that this was something like Nelson sailing to Trafalgar. It was a great moment in naval history.
Here was an opportunity, and instead of being ambushed, you are the ambusher. and I think Admiral Nimitz, he made that big decision. I think he did it with confidence.
Task Force 16 and Task Force 17 were sent to a point approximately 300 miles northeast of Kido Butai's anticipated axis of advance. The spot was open ocean, 32 north, 173 west, known as Point Luck.
Nimitz was a brilliant person. He considered everything possibility. In other words, as a submarine gent there, he knew exactly what could be done, by the enemy, what could be done this, what was the odds here, what was the odds there.
And I should thank God for the good brains on top, like Nimitz, Fletcher, Spruance, the intelligence group in Pearl Harbor, Highbow Unit. They did a great job in breaking the code. In fact, Admiral Nimitz made a statement then which seemed arrogant. He says, "I'm going to ambush the Japanese." But that's exactly what he did. There was that place called Point Luck.
So we went off, and that was how come we got out to the end of our line and we weren't attacked, and we thought we should be. So we decided to go a little bit further. So we went out about 15 more minutes and still hadn't been attacked. And we asked him about one more time, and he said, "Well, this is the last one." We had gone about 5 minutes into that second extension when General Quarters' horn went off.
On June 3rd, 1942, at 09:25, after extending his patrol leg, Ensign Jack Reed at the controls of PBY 8V55 radioed, sighted main body, and 2 minutes later radioed, bearing 262, distance 700.
I immediately thought we were under attack, and I ran up between the pilots. They sit up a little higher like that, you run up like that between them. And I'm looking up, and they tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Look down." I did. That's when I lost my enthusiasm right there, because there was 11 enemy ships coming right towards us.
Back on Midway, Commander Cyril Simard, Naval Air Station Commander, wanted more information before launching the Army Air Corps B-17s at his disposal against a sighting of a main body.
Then we got around behind them, and they kept us there for over 3 hours. Always amplify, all their things. They wanted more information about the ships and more of that. And we knew we were going to be dead in 5 minutes anyway, so we would try our best to get to the next group and then go up and take a look and try to figure out what they were.
9 B-17s under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney were launched from Midway on June 3rd. Just after 1640, they found their target. The Army Air Corps bombers dropped their bombs in 3 passes from high altitude, scattering the Japanese ships but achieving no hits. Back at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz responded to Ensign Reed's message of sighting the main body by sending a coded message to Admiral Fletcher. "This is not, repeat not, the enemy striking force. Stop. This is the landing force. The striking force will hit from the northwest tomorrow."
Of course, that was a great feather in our cap. And Admiral Nimitz made the comment to Commander Layton at that time. He said, "You were 5 miles and 5 minutes off in your projection." But the orders to Admiral Fletcher and Admiral Halsey were not to launch any aircraft or any searches against the Japanese fleet or any attacks until we had had an attack on Midway.
In fact, our flight leader, Lieutenant Fieberling, had called us all together and said that the Navy knew that there was going to be a Japanese attack against Midway.
The Japanese launched their aircraft from the 4 carriers of Kido Butai, and at 04:45, 108 enemy aircraft formed up and headed southeast toward Midway at 125 knots. The Japanese also launched a reconnaissance of their own. 7 planes, Type 97 aircraft from Akagi and Kaga, and float planes from cruisers Tone, Shikuma, and Haruna. A haphazard and poorly executed fan-shaped aerial search that would have disastrous results for the Imperial Navy. At 05:45, Lieutenant J.G. William Chase, aboard PBY 3V-58, added in the clear with an uncoded message: "Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320 degrees, distance 150. This was to be followed at 05:52 by a second message from Chase: "2 carriers and main body ships, carriers in front, course 135, speed 35.
Well, we were quite excited about the opportunity to strike.
We'd barely joined up and we were in formation when my turret gunner called me and said he could see firing back from the island.
Midway defenders faced the Japanese attack with courage, but with antiquated planes. The old Brewster Buffaloes especially were no match for the Zero fighters. The Japanese had hoped to use the airfield on Eastern Island after their invasion and had not bombed the runways, but opposition from anti-aircraft and ground fire was fiercer than expected, prompting the Japanese flight leader to radio at 0700, "There is need for a second attack wave."
Had they have landed the way we expected them, we were sure prepared. Even if they'd blown out a lot of the defenses, there'd have still been some guns there. There'd have been 50 calibers dug in those banks that survived. And maybe our old 3-inch might have, you don't know. We'd have had a lot of rifle power, and you read the history of Wake Island, you see what men can do, determined people. It'd have been a bloodbath.
Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. 0600, Fieberling's 6 Avengers, based on Midway, originally part of Hornet's VT-8, took off to engage the Japanese.
Almost an hour out from the takeoff, Bert called over the intercom and said, I can see some ships on the horizon, large ships. Almost within minutes of that occurring, then Manning called over the intercom and said, we're being attacked by Japanese fighter planes.
Well, there wasn't any question, but we had found them. The question was who'd found who.
I was down on my knees with my .30 caliber machine gun. So I looked back over my shoulder and I could see the turret had stowed and that Jim was hanging just in the harness, and obviously blood everywhere, that he was obviously dead at that point.
And we dove down to the water. The other section of 3 did the same, but they were a little behind us. So I never could see exactly what happened to them. I just don't remember exactly when they stopped firing at me. I don't guess they ever stopped firing at me.
Then the next thing I remember, I felt a real hot, almost like a soldering iron on my wrist. It was actually a bullet had grazed me and cut my wrist open, but not severely, just enough to cause some bleeding. But then I went back to my gun position, still down on my knees. And then the next thing that I do remember was hanging down and coming to, and I put my hand up on my head, and it almost felt like a hole in my head and just blood pouring off. And I was wearing a baseball cap at the time, and this is my cap that I had on, and there's the bullet hole in the cap where I'd been hit on the head.
About that time, my stick went left in my hand. She started down just slightly, because the trim just slightly nose down. I figured, well, anything I can do, I'm going to go in the water, but I'm going to drop this torpedo or something anyway. So I kicked the airplane to the left, but I got in a position where I thought I had a decent lead on the ship and I dropped the torpedo. After I dropped the torpedo, as I was about to hit the water, I rolled the elevator trim back, which I'd forgotten. I thought when I lost it and she started going down, that my elevators were gone. The elevator trim tabs were still there, and I had goofed and not realized it. Maybe it saved my life, I don't know.
When you're in a situation like that, time almost loses any significance. But I can remember hearing stuff hitting the airplane. And then after a while, it got pretty quiet. And so then I got on the intercom and called Ensign Ernest and told him that Jim was dead and asked for permission to climb up into the second seat behind the pilot. And he gave me permission to do that. And then we just motored on for probably an hour or close to an hour. And I guess simultaneously both he and I could see a lot of black smoke on the horizon and made the assumption that that probably was Midway, and Midway was on fire.
The first attack by American forces on June 4th against the Kido Butai registered no hits on the Japanese ships. The American pilots and planes were not that fortunate. In the midst of this confusion, USS Nautilus, a submarine, attacked Kido Butai with torpedoes and was counterattacked with depth charges. Nautilus was to be a persistent observer to the battle.
Then we got to talking, and by early afternoon, dive bombers during the attack on the atoll, but were pretty disappointing and dismal time that here all my shipmates were finally realized we're gone and weren't going to be back.
As the TBF Avengers and B-26 bombers were making their attack on the Japanese fleet, the planes from Hornet and Enterprise were just leaving the flight deck. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honor the charge they made.
Actually, we made our attack when the carriers were just beginning to launch their aircraft. Because Torpedo didn't make its attack, Torpedo 8, until sometime after 10 a.m. in the morning. We had attacked at 7 a.m. in the morning.
Admiral Spruance launched the planes of Task Force 16 at the earliest possible time and at the limit of their range. The plan was to catch the Japanese planes returning from the Midway strike.
On the 4th of June, when we were all launched to go out and bomb the Japs, the Enterprise and the Hornet were launched with a full group, all the squadrons and all the planes.
So the first thing was McCluskey, who was as the group commander, had us launch all our planes. We'd been sitting ready to go for more than a couple of days, you know, ready to go. And so we took off and we headed towards the Yorktown. And we're expecting the Yorktown planes to follow us.
Yorktown didn't do this. The admiral on the Yorktown said, well, I'm going to wait until we find out if there are more than 2 carriers.
I guess there was trepidation and some concern. I wouldn't say that I was ever scared, but there was certainly concern. And the minute I got in that cockpit and took off, well, training took over.
Led by leaders like Dick Best, Wade McCluskey, and John Waldron, planes from 3 American carriers flew toward the Japanese fleet. Not all the aircraft found the Japanese.
The Air Group Commander said, you're going to fly my course. Our commander was Stanhope C. Ring. He was a CAG. So when we went flying our course that we were going to intercept the Japs, we were on that course for a short time, and the torpedo planes broke off from that course and went their own course.
Plans for a coordinated attack quickly ended.
Then McCluskey, he was a fighter pilot, you know. He figured, you know, the first one that hit the other fellow was going to win. And our fuel gauge was just going down, down, down. So when we looked at the spot, you know, wherever the carrier is supposed to be, nothing there.
Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo 8 straight to the Japanese fleet.
They found the Japs, and it so happened that the torpedo planes, Torpedo 8, went right to the point where the Japs were. And they made their attack, and of course they were all shot down by the Zeros, and except for, well, they were all shot down, but Gay was the one that was in the life raft.
But those guys who flew those planes, they had the guts to make them go and do what they could, you know. But that's the American spirit, though, really.
The TBDs, the torpedo planes, were the worst of the world. I mean, carrying their torpedoes about 100 knots is about as fast as they could go. Imagine this thing, torpedo planes going on this thing, you know, knowing that they had practically zero likelihood of ever getting back, and yet they knew that their mission out there was really essential.
It was like riding in a hearse. And the torpedoes that we had were lousy.
And what was going on for Admiral Nagumo? After getting word that a second strike on Midway was needed, he had a dilemma. Planes had to be rearmed, refueled, and respotted. Unlike American carrier doctrine, the Japanese did not arm and fuel planes on the flight deck. Returning planes had to land and then be moved to the hangar deck. When Commander Waldron and VT-8 made their gallant attack at about 0930, 2 things happened. The Japanese combat air patrol was brought down from a high altitude, and the Japanese ships maneuvered to evade torpedo attacks and reversed course out of the wind, unable to immediately launch a counterattack. Where were the rest of the American planes?
Commander McCluskey, who was the Air Group Commander, happened to sight a Japanese destroyer down on that was going like hell in one direction. He decided to follow it, and he led them right to the Japs, right to the carriers.
The destroyer was the Arashi, returning to the Imperial fleet after attempting to depth charge USS Nautilus.
Well, then we came there, and here were the 3 aircraft carriers.
And then when we saw the fleets, of course, you know, you have images of things that you see sitting right here. I can see that fleet just the same as I saw it on June the 4th.
At 0949, cruiser Shikuma radioed carrier Akagi, 14 enemy planes 50 kilometers to port. Thus began the second series of torpedo attacks on the Japanese fleet by planes from the 3 American flat tops, to be followed by the accidental coordinated attack by U.S. dive bombers.
Here comes the Enterprise torpedo planes. And most of them were shot down, except for a few. And then almost immediately after that, here comes the Yorktown torpedo planes. So one after another, torpedo attacks on this, on 3 carriers.
The McCluskey and his 2 pilots, and saw that they missed. Then I watched Earl Gallagher, and he hit, and I thought that probably was his 2 100-pound incenders. And next thing you know, hear this whole thing, you know, going from that little thing up into, it was a wall of flames like 50 feet high, and coming up towards the front of the ship. Earl Gallagher went as low as was possible. His pullout was probably less than 500 feet. And I don't think mine was much higher than that either, just to make absolutely sure that we're going to get a hit. So I watched and made sure that I had landed, you know, right near the red circle.
Because of the structure of the Japanese ships, the hangar decks have no access to the outside. They're all closed in. So if a bomb goes down to the hangar deck and explodes, it ain't going to be out the side. The explosion won't go out the side. It all takes place inside. So it's just like an explosion followed by an implosion.
I released and immediately turned to counter his attack and got down as low in the water as I could. And we're now in the middle of the Japanese fleet. And it's kind of comical. My real seat gunner, Anderson by name, said, let's get the hell out of here. And I said, what do you think I'm trying to do?
Dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown successfully attacked 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Soryu, and Kaga. But Hiryu was not hit.
But as of 10:20 in the morning, not a single ship had been damaged, and at 10:25 or 10:26, depending on who you listen to, 3 carriers were sunk.
The amazing thing about it is they had no idea the American fleet was there. No idea whatsoever. It's tough to fight a battle like that. You know how when you search an area, you have a pie-shaped arc form. They sent scout planes all through that to find if there's an American fleet out there. The Japanese cruiser Tone was to launch their ship, their plane, for a particular piece of that pie, that arc. The plane was 30 minutes late getting off. The admiral should have replaced that plane immediately, but he didn't. And then, so that one place where they did not see is where we were.
Dive bombers from the Enterprise and Hornet arrived almost simultaneously, and in less than 10 minutes, the balance of naval momentum changed in the Pacific. But what happened to the planes of the 3rd American carrier, USS Hornet?
Our air group wasn't a very good air group because we didn't have the practice of doing anything together. The only thing we did together at any time was on our shakedown cruise. It's like a baseball team. We had no spring training, we had no season, and we went right straight to the World Series at the Battle of Midway. In the case of the Enterprise group and the Yorktown group, they were combat ready.
Without the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, that brief window in time may have closed.
And I continually think, you know, of my good friend Tom Eversole in Pocatello, Idaho. Here, he knew that his chances of survival were almost zilch. And yet, in other words, still going out there, doing his thing, you know, doing this incredible thing, giving us just a perfect chance to do our job. And I figure, well, if there aren't any saints in heaven, he has to be one.
Between 11 and 11:15 in the morning, American planes began appearing over their respective carriers after the strike on Kido Butai.
So I don't know how much gas I had, but I certainly didn't have much. I think Dusty Cleese claims he had a couple of teaspoons or something.
At 1100, Hiryu sent 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters aloft, followed by 10 torpedo bombers and 6 more fighters at 1331. Shortly after noon, the Val dive bombers found the Yorktown and its task force still taking aboard its dive bombers. Yorktown had 12 Wildcats overhead flying cap, and these fighters took out half the Vals. Yorktown's escorts took out 2 more with AA, but 8 Vals made it through and scored 3 bomb hits on Yorktown.
I can remember on the starboard, looking out from the starboard side, I was on the flight deck. Here was about 3 or 4 at least Japanese planes going down that had been shot down. And then, just, I say minutes, seconds later, here was this guy dropped a bomb on us. But the thing I remember about it so much that it was tumbling. It didn't come right straight down like most bombs did. And I think that's why the explosive on that one all went to starboard, and it wiped out the 1.1 mount. That was horrible.
We had a fire hose there, and he took that, and I turned the water on for him. We got the fire out, and then started helping getting the guys that were still alive down off the 1.1 mounts. All happened very quickly. Blew a hole in the flight deck about as large as the living room.
After midday, when the Yorktown was attacked, we were about 5-10 miles away, I guess. And we stood, it was like a movie watching the attack on the Yorktown, but they stopped there, they never came near us.
The sky's black, and what you're seeing is about the 1 out of 5 burst. The others are, you don't really see, except the tracers. So the sky is really full of dangerous objects, and they're flying right through it. They were determined to press forward their attack on the Yorktown.
But I think we come out of it pretty good with it, as far as the bombs are concerned. But one of them hit the stack and blew out the fire rooms, and so we were dead in the water.
The next one hit down, and the forward bow started a persistent fire in the rag locker.
The low point was when Admiral Fletcher left us to go aboard a cruiser.
But we had a very fine engineering crew, and in 2 hours, or 1 hour I think it was, they completely got the engines up running again and got the steam in the right places. However, we could only do 15 knots. And to dodge torpedoes, you got to do better than that. In the Coral Sea, we dodged 12 torpedoes on a run, and of course Yorktown then did probably 32, 34 knots, and the skipper missed them all. But now you do 15 knots.
At 1443, the Japanese torpedo bombers passed through the destroyer and cruiser screen and launched their fish at Yorktown. 2 torpedoes from this attack hit the carrier on the port side.
And finally we hear the word, stand by for torpedo attack.
the water was very clear, and the warheads on their torpedoes, on these two anyway, were painted bright yellow, and I could see them under the water come in and hit the ship.
The bomb blast is a blast. Torpedo is kind of like a grumbling roar. One admiral said it's like a little dog shaking a rat, you know. It's just a roar, a rumble. But you know the guts of your ship are being tore out, but you don't know where.
It's quite a sensation to get hit by a torpedo. The Yorktown was 20,000 tons or whatever, and I'll swear it lifted us a couple feet off straight up in the air and right back down.
The ship rolled up, rocked, ship stem to stern, shook. I thought we were going to go right over. The hangar deck went down to the water, 26, 28 degrees, and you couldn't walk on the decks.
Finally, the commanding officer put an order over the speakers, abandon ship. You take your shoes off and climb up the deck. And the deck crew had dropped 2-inch lines from the flight deck down to the water, all along the ship, probably 2 or 3, 4, 5 feet apart, all along the ship. People from the bridge and the deck, flight deck, would come down those lines. We from below would go up to the hangar deck, find the high side where the lines are, find a space on the line, and go down to the water.
The problem was, when you're abandoning a ship like that, there's oil all over the water, vapors are coming up, it burns your eyes, it burns your nostril. If you get any of that in your mouth, you throw up.
We had Kapok life jackets, the old Mae West life jackets. And all you do is stay afloat till you get picked up. And but what happened there was our own destroyers would come up in a group of people, real slow so as not to turn them up, and move in real slow, hang cargo nets over the side. And you can't swim in that stuff, but as the sea would wash you up alongside any of these destroyers, you'd hang on, then they had men there to pull you over on the deck.
So they picked me up and flopped me on the cold steel deck. And I looked for a place to go. The deck's covered with sailors, different conditions. Went down below, and the mess tables are being used for operating tables. People are in shock, they're under blankets and that sort of thing.
My skipper, for example, Dick Best, was, I think, the one that kept making the point there's another carrier out there. And so that afternoon we put together what was left of our planes, what was left of the Yorktown, and some of the Hornet planes had gotten back to the carriers, their carrier, and so put them all together and they went out.
Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise sent aloft 24 aircraft under the command of Earl Gallagher of VS-6. The complement of aircraft included planes from VB-6 and Yorktown's VB-3. There were no accompanying fighters as they were providing cover to the carriers.
Earl Gallagher missed, so I took his corrections, you know, figure, you know, he had already added this much, so I added in that I did in the morning. And I'm pretty sure they landed on exactly on the same place on the ship, on the Hiryu, as I did that morning on the Kaga.
4 hits on Hiryu inflicted massive damage. The fires became uncontrollable, and the order to abandon ship was given in the early hours of June 5th. The 4 carriers, sent to conquer Midway and draw out the U.S. fleet, rested on the floor of the Pacific Ocean.
They didn't really have to go in June. They could have waited until the Zukaku and the Shokaku were operational. And boy, that would have been a different situation had they done that.
On the evening of June 4th, Admiral Kudita's 4 heavy cruisers, Kumano, Suzoya, Mikuma, and Mogami, with 2 destroyer escorts, were steaming toward Midway for a night bombardment of the island with their 8-inch guns. They were sighted by U.S. submarine Tambor as they maneuvered to evade and attack the sub. Cruisers Mogami and Mikuna collided. The damaged Mogami was left in the protection of Mikuna, and the rest of Kurita's cruisers sped off.
And but anyway, we caught up with them, you know, the second day. And So the weather was just ideal and so on. Here was the ship going this way, and well, we just made shambles out of the William.
On June 6th, the abandoned Yorktown was still afloat and listing.
Captain Buckmaster came back to the Hammond. He was looking for volunteers of the different professionals or classifications. So he knew me, so when I stepped up, he says, go over there, sign your name. So 141 enlisted, and I think 15 or 20 officers of the different disciplines, engineering, electronics, or whatever, all volunteered aboard the Hammond, and we went back early morning, June the 6th, and went aboard the Yorktown. Then I went down to where we were pushing airplanes overboard, and we're lowering them from the overhead, brand new torpedo planes especially. They were spares. We lowered them down, pushed them overboard. One of those torpedo planes, the TBD-1, is mine. When we pushed it through the hangar deck door that was open, I said, Captain Buckmaster, I was a little brazen, I guess, please give me this torpedo plane. He says, you got it, Roy, and over it went. Splashed in the ocean and floated a little bit, and down it went. So I have one at 17,000 feet if I can go get it someday.
They were, as you say, they were towing Yorktown, going to tow it back to Pearl Harbor with a 27-degree list at 1 1/4 knot per hour. But they were doing it. They'd sent a fleet tug out to do that. They would have made it, except 2 days later, late June 6th, the submarine I-158 got inside the radar range of the destroyers, and they fired 4 shots. 1 missed, 2 caught Yorktown below the bridge keels, and 1 caught the Hammond. The Hammond had come alongside to supply water and electricity. They were going to try to flood the Yorktown and right it. But that submarine, that one torpedo caught the Hammond nearly midship broadside and broke the thing in half. And I think nearly all hands went down because their depth charges went off in the water.
In a matter of minutes, the Hammond sank, and the salvage crew of Yorktown prepared to abandon ship a second time.
Went up to the bridge, and he says, take some pictures. So I took pictures. And suddenly, the Yorktown rolled to port, went down stern first.
Admiral Spruance and Fletcher had successfully carried out Admiral Nimitz's order.
Midway changed the world. At that time, in that Japan had a great navy. They're not to be underrated.
Well, I guess because we depended on a lot of luck to win. It was a big gamble. I thought it was a brilliant name, although I don't think I realized it at the time. I don't think many did, that we could have lost that battle very, very easily.
So, if we had lost Midway, we probably would have lost Guadalcanal. Australia would have been at risk. It was truly a dynamic situation.
What kind of nerves did Admiral Nimitz have to risk the striking force of the American Navy in one major sea battle?
I don't know whether he was a poker player himself or not, but he made it clear. He made it clear to his staff and to his subordinates that they were going into this battle employing the doctrine of calculated risk. He knew the risks. He knew that we could have lost everything or been totally ineffective. But he urged them to do their best, and they did. And as I say, I still think there was a big element of luck.
Commander Rochefort, for example, broke the Japanese code and convinced Admiral Nimitz that, there was going to be an attack on Midway. Admiral Nimitz believed him, and he committed the whole Pacific Fleet at that point in time to this Battle of Midway.
Intelligence enabled the United States Navy to participate in the battle. The battle was won by the courage and action, mainly of the aviators, as well as people supporting them, the ship drivers, and the Marines on Midway.
The 4 ships that bombed Pearl Harbor were sunk at Midway.
And I think it's probably true that a loss at Midway and our probable reaction to that loss could well have delayed our progress in giving priority to the European war, could have delayed it by a year or maybe 2, prolonged the entire war.
We celebrate Midway every year. In fact, what was it, 2 years ago, I think, Chief of Naval Operations issued an edict. The Navy will celebrate 2 days every year. We'll stand down and celebrate 2 days. One's the birthday of the Navy, and one is to observe the victory at Midway.
The Battle of Midway was it, as far as World War II is concerned. It was the deciding factor.